gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dennis R. MacDonald, Richard Carrier, welcome. It's awesome to have you two together. Who was that running, naked, fleeing young man in the Gospel of Mark?
Well, it wasn't him. No, Derek, thank you. And I'm going to call you Derek. And I'm Dennis. And I'm going to call you Richard.
Cool.
Excellent.
Okay. One of the great mysteries of the Gospel of Mark appears at the end of chapter 14 at Jesus' Gethsemane arrest, when the disciples all flee, and there's a young man who is wearing only a sindon, a linen garment around himself, and he leaves that garment behind and runs off naked.
Yep.
And people
that is actually in the text, yes.
But it's not in Matthew's version of Mark's story, and it's not in Luke's version of Mark's story. And I think the author of the Dionysian Gospel knew that story because you have also a Gethsemane episode and an arrest. And it was an embarrassment in the early church. Let's go then to the empty tomb story. In Mark, there's another young man, he's called a neoniscos.
Yeah, same word in Greek.
And now he's parababamenos. He is wearing, and it's the same word that was used in Mark 14. In Mark 14, the fellow was wearing a linen cloth, a sindon. Now the young man in the tomb is wearing a white robe. Instead of fleeing, he's the one who gives witness to the resurrection. And many interpreters have thought that this is an intent, it's the same young man. Matthew makes the young man into an angel. Luke makes him into two angels. Yeah. So this is a tremendous inconsistency in the synoptic narratives, and it's strategic and important. Many people have thought that this young man is a symbol for the baptismal initiate, who in going to the baptism is wearing one coarse garment and is identified with death, and takes off the garment and is naked. And as Jesus dies, he's naked when he's dying. He's wrapped in a sindon, the same word, the linen cloth. And instead of Jesus in the tomb, it's a young man in the tomb giving witness to Jesus. And it's possible that it, in fact, is a baptismal conceit.
And that would also jive with I think it's a resurrection metaphor as well, because the linen body, the words for garments are often used in describing the body. So like linen garment is the trash body, the body you throw away. And the white robes represents the risen body, right? The glorious body. So there's like a death and resurrection metaphor going on in there. But that's what the baptism was, a death and resurrection
that's
metaphor.
Right. And in the Gospel of Thomas, you have a passage, I have put away when you put away the garment of sin or something like that, the body of the flesh, then you have this resurrection, unification of the divine with the divine. But there's another aspect to this young man. And now I'm going to tell a story from the Odyssey, in which you have another naked young man, and Virgil imitates him twice in the Aeneid. Odysseus is at the home of Circe, and he and his men want to go home. But before they go home, they have a final feast, and all of the men fall asleep in the halls of Circe. But Odysseus is told that he needs to go to Hades to consult with the blind seer Tiresias in order to get instructions on how to get home to Ithaca. Now, so in the morning, and by the way, Odysseus is troubled to death because he has to go to death. And the irony is palpable. Then Odysseus raises his men, and there's a young man named Elpenor, which in Greek means would like to be a man, as opposed to Aeneid, a nobleman. And he's drunk from the feast. He forgets that he's on Circe's roof trying to get enough air to sleep off his drunk. He falls off of the roof and dies. But Odysseus doesn't realize that this young man has died. So Odysseus goes to the netherworld, and the first soul to meet him is that of Elpenor. And he says to him, "Oh, unfortunate Elpenor, what are you doing here?" So Elpenor tells him the story, and he says, "Look, my body's back at Circe's island. You can't go home until you go back and bury me, because my soul will never have reprieve in Hades if the body is unburied." And so Odysseus agrees to it. So in chapter 12, he goes back to Circe's island and buries the corpse. Luke interprets this story in the Acts of the Apostles in the story of Eutychus, and his name means lucky. Yeah. He is on in a window. He hears Paul preach, and it's so boring that he falls and dies. Paul goes down and says, "Oh, don't worry, he's dead, but his soul is in him." In other words, it hasn't departed to Hades. Then at dawn the next day he leaves, and then they go back and they raise up the body of Eutychus. Eutychus in Greek means lucky. And in the Homeric story we hear about unfortunate Elpenor. Now, artists depicted Elpenor as nude, as a young man nude who's coming to visit Odysseus in the netherworld. And the nudity is because his garments, being nude means that the soul no longer has a body. So there again, the garment is a body.
There's a reference to this in Galatians 5, too, the idea of the different bodies, and we don't want to be naked, we want to be clothed with the resurrection body.
So Virgil has two examples of imitations of the story. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, it would be apparently an embarrassment or difficulty for Mark to narrate Jesus meeting the disciples at the end of the Gospel, because then he'd have to tell them to get out of Jerusalem before the Jewish war. And so he needs a substitute to be there. And so that the young man in the tomb gives witness to the resurrection, which is a happy outcome, whereas Elpenor is buried at dawn to give witness to the permanence of death. And there are other examples in the novels where you have characters like this who visit the netherworld and come back. The most famous example is the myth of Ur. Ur is a young man who dies in a battle. He goes and he sees the torments of the wicked and comes back to life and gives witness to what he saw. And Socrates says that means that we should live just and righteous lives because we want to be for 1,000 years with the blessed and not for 1,000 years with the damned. It's a very powerful and amazing story. And these stories were known in antiquity.
Widely known.
So Mark is using a Homeric trope to have a substitute at the tomb. And now he is not just a tragic character. He's a character who gives a message of hope. But you blame the women for not telling the disciples to go to Galilee and see Jesus there, and therefore the Jerusalem church suffers. Now, this is my unique interpretation of it, but I would stand by it, and I would think it's one of the more coherent and...
It is a plausible explanation for why Mark ends it that way.
Yeah.
Why specifically say that the women told no one? You know, that's a weird... Everybody recognizes, all scholars recognize it's a weird way to end the book.
If I may, just to get it from you,
where do you stand on it right now? I mean, you're probably not dogmatic in this anyway. I mean, you love...
Yeah, no, I think it's a plausible theory. I don't know if we can prove that it's true, but it makes sense of the text. But the underlying metaphor of the Neoniskos, that's clear. It's obvious that this is all metaphor and allegory for the resurrection and that whole narrative of, and it is reversing, like he's saying, reversing the Elpenor narrative, which was the standard narrative in the ancient world. You know, there were mystery religions that would offer you the secret code to get into the nice part of the afterlife, but most, you know, the typical view was that no, you would go to Hades and eat ashes, right? It would just not a great way to end. And so that's what happens to Elpenor, right? So that's the narrative. And this narrative would, like you said, everybody would know this narrative. It'd be taught everywhere. Not only, you know, we're talking about authors of books who therefore have read Homer. When you got educated in Greek to the level of being able to narrate stories like this, you were thoroughly versed in Homer like this. That was the standard school book for years and years and years before you even got to this level of composition. So they would definitely know the story. But also these stories and allusions would be in public speeches all the time, right? Because it's everybody, all the elite, everybody's doing speeches, everybody's writing, everybody's talking about this. They use these stories, so they're everywhere. And it was kind of like you had to know this cultural package to understand these things. So that's why Homer was the central textbook for learning Greek in the ancient world. So they definitely, not only they know what they're doing here, they know that this is, as Dennis MacDonald has said in his books, transvaluation. They're taking the story everybody knows and the story everybody's told and reversing it, saying like, no, we have a better story.
Making it better.
Our version is better, right? So you should follow our path of things, right? So that's what they're doing. And you know, if you know the text, as everybody back then would, they know Homer and stuff, so they would get the point. Like it would be obvious that we get what you're saying, right? So, no, that part of it is, I think, indisputable. That is absolutely what Mark is doing with this.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, this brings up Morton Smith. And
I was going to get there.
So I could see, and no one knows this but me, I'm lucky, why he was pissed off at you. So can you tell us the story, and then tell us, both of you, so he's not the only one in the hot seat here, did his secret Gospel of Mark turn out, in your view, to be a forgery? And where do you stand on it?
Well, we should set this up, first of all, right? Like, a lot of people won't know what we're talking about here,
yes.
right? So,
let me set it up.
Yeah, okay.
Richard got his PhD at Columbia University. And that's where Morton Smith taught. And I taught across the street as a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary.
And my advisor, by the way, at Columbia was William Harris, who also worked with Morton Smith. So they were friends-ish. So Harris also had opinions about all of this, but they mostly align with what Dennis is going to say. So.
Well, in fact, Harris wrote a wonderful review of the Homeric epics in the Gospel of Mark, as a matter of fact. It was one of the earliest ones. So this happens in New York City, Upper West Side, Morningside Heights. And I was to give a lecture to a group of scholars at Columbia. And I sat next to Morton Smith at a dinner at the faculty club at Columbia, and we had a congenial conversation. And it's one of the first times that I gave publicly my theory that Mark was imitating Homer. And as a very modest part of the presentation, I talked about this naked young man as a potential Elpenor character, and that he's the same person who was at the empty tomb. And when I was done, Morton Smith was the first to get up, shouting at me and denouncing me. I obviously had hit a nerve, and I never had somebody jump on me like that. And my guess is that I had hit a button called The Naked Young Man in Mark, because he had written a book on the secret Gospel of Mark, which even today is contested with its theory that this character is a secret initiate of Jesus, to whom he taught the mysteries of the kingdom of God overnight, naked to naked, and so on. I mean, the potential homosexual implications are obvious. And so it still is debated today. My story isn't done, though. 2 weeks later, Morton Smith was dead. And I was actually involved in the repositioning of his library. So there's a real irony here. And to this day, one of his students said I killed him, and because he had a cardiac arrest 2 weeks after this event, and apparently he hadn't attended his classes in the meantime. So I don't think I killed him, honestly, but it made me suspicious about charges of forgery. Now, I think it's okay for scholars to disagree on this topic. But the one part I don't think we can disagree on is that the naked young man was a part of Mark's original imitation of Homer. There may have been a forgery of or an alternative version of the Gospel of Mark that was circulating in Alexandria in circles for catechumens and initiates. That's possible. And it's possible that Morton Smith discovered that forgery. It's very difficult now for us to tease out all the issues. My own personal understanding is that I think Morton Smith forged it. And I don't do it just for my personal reasons.
Scholars agree.
And there are philological reasons to do it, for the shaping of the characters and parts of Clement of Alexandria that seem to have been lifted. And
the convenience with which the original has disappeared, and so on. So,
right. So I'm a skeptic about the secret Gospel of Mark, but I don't wish to be dogmatic about that. But from my perspective, I'm willing to be dogmatic that the naked young man was in the Gospel of Mark doing something quite different than learning from Jesus at night, naked to naked, about the kingdom of God.
Right.
And that pissed Morton Smith off. I see it, he had so much at stake with it, especially with him claiming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he needed Secret Gospel of Mark to be an original version of Mark, basically.
Yeah.
And that's the problem and trouble within scholarship, is when you come up with
Sometimes people get so attached to a theory they can't let it go, yeah. And then we get outrageously, indecorously emotional about it at a talk, at a lecture like that is usually a good sign that something is not rational happening here.
I think that's really interesting, though, your position and the way that you interpret that makes a lot of sense. And this to make sure I elaborate here just a second, to make sure the naked young man represents kind of a spirit person, a person who had died and come from the other world.
Well, he represents the whole narrative, right? So, of Elpenor, so he's a better Elpenor. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a modern cinematic analogy. We do this in films all the time, where you have you rewrite a story and then change the ending, right? It's Quentin Tarantino, and they kill Hitler at the end, right? We don't see that coming. So he's taking the story that we all know. We know who Hitler is, and we know who the different kinds of soldiers we sent in. All of the World War II narrative he's created is all built out of things that really exist, but it's all fiction. But then he changes the narrative because he's telling a different story, right? He wants a different message at the end. And so this is the same kind of thing that's going on here. Is they want their myth to be better. Our myth is better than your myth. Your myth is sad and pathetic, and look what happens to Elpenor. Who wants that? We have a better Elpenor. Here's our guy, the Neoniskos, the young man who represents youth and vitality and stuff. He dies, he becomes naked and dead, symbolically dead, and then he's clothed with the resurrection body, the white garment, and so on. So there's rabbinical texts and stuff where they talk about the resurrected will be in white garments, glowing white garments, yada yada. So this is actually recognized symbolism back then. People would get what they were talking about, and so that they're just updating it, right? They want a better version of this myth, and so that's what they've done with it.
But I agree with that, and in fact, this is just a coda to what Richard said. In the Odyssey, Elpenor is a counter-hero. His name means I want to be a man. Odysseus is the real hero who's willing to go to the netherworld to try to get home with his comrades, who are called Aeneid, that is, the men of renown. or strength, so that when Elpenor gets buried, he wants to be buried like a big hero. And that means usually you'd have a barrow over the burnt bones, and you'd put a man's weapons on top of the barrow if they're a trophy, right? If they're a real hero. What's put on Elpenor's mound? It's an oar. He was simply an oarman. He was not a hero. So the same, and then, so you have, and there are articles on Eutychus as a counter-hero over against Odysseus. The same thing happens in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is going to his death, and he knows it, and this young guy flees naked. And it's a syndrome. Jesus dies, and he's buried naked with a syndrome. Jesus is raised back to life, and the young man now is clothed and in the tomb, so that now instead of the shameful burial of the counter-hero, or the anti-hero almost, in the Odyssey, now the young man is heroic himself in identification with Jesus' death.
Right. Yeah, spot on.
So it's very clever.